Hello, this is CapCan Knows, the official podcast of the Capital Area College Access Network. You may be familiar with our newsletter articles of the same name. We are excited to engage the community in conversations about college access. I am your host, Jacob Tkaczyk, an AmeriCorps Vista, serving with the Capital Area College Access Network. Joining me today is Hornak, professor in the Department of Educational Leadership at CMU, and once again joining us is CapCan's Executive Director, Michele Strasz. So before we get started, Anne, I want to thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here and engage in this conversation.
Awesome. I'm really excited to get into this. We talked a little bit beforehand, and I'm excited for you to share with your expertise and knowledge with our audience. But Michele, I believe you're going to start us off.
Yeah, so thanks, Anne, for being here. We are embarking in CapCan on a really exciting new initiative to focus on rural college access. Traditionally, we've worked very closely with our Lansing School District partners, but now we want to, as we've merged with Eaton County, focus on our out-county school districts. And so we've been talking with you in preparation, certainly, for the work that we're going to do and then our conversation today about what are some of the challenges, barriers, and opportunities in working with our rural students. So to start off, what research is helpful for us to consider to guide our community conversations about rural college access?
Yeah, it's amazing how, 70% of America is considered rural, and it's amazing that as scholars in higher education, in the social sciences and across other disciplines, is we're actually doing little empirical. There's really a gap in the literature and who's doing this work. So a lot of the work now is, I won't say all anecdotal, but a lot of it is pulled from some of our national data sets. NCES, which is the National Center for Educational Statistics. NSF is doing some work. And really what we have available at this point is situating who rural college students are. What we need to do is actually understand the ways in which they're engaging with higher education, not engaging with higher education, and most importantly, I think, is why they're not engaging with higher education, which I think is research that would be important to different communities and begin to break down some of those barriers. A lot of the work also comes from Inside Higher Ed, which is largely a newspaper. It's scholarly, but it's not peer-reviewed, or the Chronicle of Higher Education. So it's a bit more anecdotal, and we need to do some work. So this project is very exciting to help contribute in those ways.
Mm-hmm. So as a follow-up, you alluded to that there are barriers for our rural students in accessing any type of post-secondary degrees or credentials. What are some of the barriers that either have been researched or things that, I guess, in that anecdotal experience that we've been observing about our students?
Right. So one thing I would say is we wouldn't want to overgeneralize these to all rural, seeking students. But I think what we know and what we have some pretty good information about is most of these students are first-generation college students. So levels of education of home is a big indicator of completion and persistence. So when I frame it this way, is the conversations at home aren't about, well, what are you going to do after high school? Students kind of lose sight of, well, I'm going to graduate and then go to work, which is probably the model that they have at home. So first generation can be a barrier. It's also, when we have parents and guardians that haven't gone to college, we know that our college students, the first place they go when they need help is usually not an academic advisor or a resident hall assistant, or if they're at a community college, a counselor, is home, and home doesn't have that frame of reference, so it becomes frustrating. So first generation status can be a barrier. Income, and again, I don't want to overgeneralize that all rural college students are low income, but they are some of our lower income. We know that from some of our census data. So income can be a barrier to paying for college. It's not getting any cheaper. We're actually pricing a number of Americans out of university. So these initiatives and talking about free community college, we've done a lot of work in regards to access, getting students to the door. It's a lot of times we'll front load that money and then it dries up sophomore, junior, senior year. So financing to the end is an important conversation we need to have, not just at the beginning. Another big barrier is, I think, the narrative around what colleges and universities do in terms of helping students explore who they are, their own identities. And I think this can be scary for some families. So there's lots of myths and stereotypes about colleges being these liberal beacons, and they change students' values, and they, in reality, really what we want, what a major goal of college is to help students be critical thinkers and begin to use their own internal capacities and their own internal cognitive capacities to make decisions. Not just think about, this is what my parents or guardians did, so this is what I have to do. Is actually, I teach a student development theory class, and I use the example of religious or spiritual exploration. And growing up, you probably didn't have a lot of choice about the ways in which you were going to worship. Well, at college and university, you have choices. Like, start to make those, explore those. If what home does didn't work for you, explore some of those. That's scary change is scary. So it's also scary to think I'm going to send my son or daughter off to college and they're going to change. And their worldview is going to be forever different. And ultimately, they may not come home. Which is scary for families. So I think that's a barrier that we don't talk enough about. The last one is fit, and feeling like you fit in a college or university. So I know, Michele, we've had conversations about students that come from farming communities and then attending college or university where that's not the experience of their students. So there's no social connection there, and the ability to kind of seamlessly have conversations and make friends is challenging. And fit and sense of belonging are huge indicators of persistence and retention to a degree.
And we know these are similar barriers for our urban students as well, but they become they're differently complicated for our rural students who come from different backgrounds and cultures, and then have to experience people from lots of other different backgrounds and cultures as well.
Right, and I think when you come from an urban setting, it's easier to meet other people from similar urban, even if they're not from the same city. It's, we're in Michigan, so we have lots of students that come from Detroit, and students from Chicago have similar experiences. So I think there's even, ways that they socially connect, that if you're from an urban area, a rural area, and trying to connect with urban students, there's such a disconnect from where you came from and sort of how you approach the world.
Right, and I really think there's that big value for rural students. For example, I like to think of me and one of my absolute best friends I made when I did go to college at CMU. My first year was my roommate. My roommate Luna, he grew up in New York City, went to high school in New York City. I grew up in the small town of Williamston, just east of here. It's a small farming community, smack dab in the middle of other small farming communities. And so you have big city guy, country boy, hang out, but we were able to realize we really weren't that different. We both liked football, we both valued our education, we both wanted to do something with our lives. And I really think that that is a strong barrier, because going to Williamston's a little different, where it is a small country town, but it's not I think the stereotypical rural town that comes to mind when someone says a rural town. And I think CMU is a great fit for most rural students from experience, because it does have that rural town fit. It doesn't seem as big as it really is, but it's also not as small as some people think. And it is a pretty close-knit community, and I think it's really easy for many people from all sorts of backgrounds to fit at home. So I just think it's a great experience. And
well, so I love the way you framed that, Jacob, because you were able to get past that and those initial really big differences to forge that connection. So I think sometimes we don't create the opportunities to forge those big initial differences to get to those similarities, as we see those differences, and that becomes kind of a wall, and I have nothing in common with you, Michele, therefore, I mean, you could play out the rest of that narrative.
Definitely.
So you have also done a lot of research on access and affordability in higher education. What are some of the lessons that you have learned about the needs of rural students?
So we focus, the literature I should say, focuses a lot on paying for college and the cost of tuition, room and board in some cases, and then we kind of end there. And for those of us that have attended college, we know that the cost of college that's not where it ends. There's lots of hidden costs in engaging and fully engaging on a college campus. A few of them, and one that I would hone in on is the idea of, or the issue of transportation. So I'll use CMU as a good example. In Michigan, we, if the listeners could see me, I'm holding up my hand, but in my mitten. Mount Pleasant is middle north. It's not north, but it is, if you draw a line across Mount Pleasant horizontally, there's not, until you get to the UP, another 4-year institution in the Lower Peninsula. So we do get a lot of rural students who attend CMU by virtue of geographically where it's located. I also think there's a bit of safety in terms of what Jacob was talking about with size, feeling like you fit, kind of seeing yourself at that institution. But with that comes, most first-year students don't have cars on campus. There's no mass transit in the state of Michigan, so getting to and from home is very challenging and becomes a huge barrier. Inevitably, college students get homesick, and not being able to, spending weeks on campus, those can actually have detrimental impact on mental health, their ability to fully engage in classes, their sense of belonging. I could keep, kind of talking about that. So, that's a big issue that falls right in line with the access and affordability. The other piece with rural college students, and in thinking about some of the lessons that we've learned, is that those hidden costs in college, what a lot of students the ways in which they'll make those up is by working. So when I was at university, I worked on campus. So college campuses, if you work on campus as a student, I was not a work study student, but I could still only work 20 hours a week. And that's very intentional. So you take 15 credit hours of classes, there's 15 hours a week. 20 hours, I'm at 35. Now I add studying, add a few co-curricular activities. It starts to add up. When you compound low income with rural, add work, 20 hours doesn't pay the bills. And we know from a lot of research that especially Laura Perna has done is we have students that are working the 20 hours on campus, taking 15 credit hours and working another 20-hour-a-week job. Well, start doing the math on that. That doesn't usually lead to academic success. The other piece that I think compounds with rural students, especially rural students that come from farming communities, is there's an expectation that on breaks that one will come home and work and contribute to the family industry. And it doesn't have to be a farm. Lots of families from rural communities are entrepreneurs and small business owners. And there's the modeling is that you'll come home and work in the store, the farm, whatever industry it is. And I think that can be increasingly challenging when you're trying to kind of forge an identity on campus and find where you belong socially. So those become issues that all relate to paying for it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't that long ago. So we're 2019. In 2009, I did a study called Nickel and Dimed on College Campus, and we looked across 6 states. One of the things we found is many of our residence halls didn't have meals on Sunday nights. So you had your whatever meal plan, but the cafeterias all closed, or the dining commons all closed at after lunch on Sundays. It left a big number of our students without an extra $5, $10, $15, which as a professional doesn't seem like a lot of money. It's a lot of money for a college student.
Especially if they're not working.
Absolutely.
They're trying to focus on their academics or their extracurriculars.
Yeah.
Like, luckily for me, that wasn't the case when I was at Central, but because I didn't work while I was up there until my last couple of years, so when I was out of the dorms by then and focused on buying my own food and cooking for myself, but that would have not gone over well with me or my roommates if we couldn't get that Sunday night dinner. So
well, and how books? We haven't even talked about books. What was your most expensive book that you bought, Jacob? You're younger than I am.
Thankfully, communication and political science textbooks were not overly expensive.
Okay.
It was more my university program courses. I believe that I had was it geometry? I think it was a geometry textbook. I don't know why I took geometry, but I think it was upwards of $400, $500 alone.
Yeah.
And I've heard horror stories of worse, and I had friends who were more in science and math-based programs that spent thousands more than I did. So, but I always went for used, and that's what I always recommend to new college students is look for used books.
Right.
When you can.
So think about. I have lots of access to know that you can rent books, you can check books out from the library. Mm-hmm. Remember I said a lot of our rural college students come from first generation families, so there's a educational capital and knowledge there that a lot of these students don't have. So they think the only way I can get my books is to go to the bookstore and actually buy them. We could go on and on, lots of barriers.
Mm-hmm. So before we started the podcast, we were talking about the fact that you are going to be the parent of a freshman in college this fall. So we want to be able to talk a little bit next about what are some of the messages that adults need to reinforce as they're interacting with first generation students, whether they're a parent or a professional.
So one of the biggest things I think is colleges and universities have so many resources. And I even know I know that my daughter will probably call home. That's a natural instinct, that's a comfort. Mm-hmm. Now, she's lucky enough to have 2 parents that have gone to college and can help her navigate that. But I still, as a parent, one of my responsibilities is, have you talked to your RA, resident assistant? Have you gone to your academic advisor? Have you gone to your college success coach? So home needs to start referring our students back to the resources on campus. I, as a faculty member, I can't pretend that I am going to know everything about her liberal arts courses she needs to take, and that's not my world. There's limits to my knowledge. I can help her lots in other ways. But we need to, I want to say, kind of educate parents, and it's doubly tough for first generation parents who don't speak that language, because our students don't speak that language. And we always joke that on college campuses we have our own language. So Jacob, you probably learned this pretty quickly, is what is that office? We use lots of acronyms in education and sort of code speak to each other in what sounds like a foreign tongue. So it can be difficult to make that transition, that leap. So as parents and professionals outside, the best we can do for our students that are on campus that are calling us, maybe crying, is refer them back to what the resources on campus. And there's tons of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I know one of the things, I have a son who had different learning disabilities and special needs, and so we talk a lot about, with children who have special needs, learning how to be self-advocates.
Yes.
And I think we don't necessarily talk about that with general ed students, but that's really what we're saying here, is that we need to train our kids to be self-advocates and turn to those resources that are available. Now, having said that, I will say, as a parent of a student with special needs, but certainly for all parents, recognizing that you can no longer, as the parent, talk to those resources unless you have your student's permission.
Right.
And so that's something that, as a parent and a child, you need to talk about before they leave for school. Yeah. Do I have permission? Will you sign the form, the FERPA form, that allows me to be able to call up financial aid and ask a question, or call and talk to the advising office? So you need to have open communication with your child as well. And I, again, it's back to that speak. Most families don't know that when your adult child goes off to college, that permission ends unless that student gives you that permission.
And I think that can be extremely challenging. I spent 7 years as an academic advisor, and I would get parents that would call and say, but I'm paying the bill. And that doesn't work. It's not an avenue that you can, it's not leverage that a parent has. So absolutely. The self-advocacy is important because we don't actually teach students how to do that. I mean, that has to come from home. We don't do that in high schools. We don't prepare them. We really, we look at the academic preparation, and that's really where we focus on. And I think some of that self-advocacy has to be that social piece, and it's developing the capacity for that. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Excellent. So what resources should we be designing for rural students to prepare them for the transition to college? We kind of talked about early on how culture shock is a major barrier in itself. So what type of resources do you think we should be designing?
We need to do a lot more work preparing. So I'm going to answer this in two ways. One is preparing students, but we also need to prepare our colleges and universities to receive. So we need to do a lot more work in terms of preparing students for all the diversity that they're going to engage with. So many rural areas of America are extremely white, and that's not what a lot of our colleges and universities look like. Even at predominantly white institutions, even a CMU has, in the upwards of 17% students of color, international students, students who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. And if we do not prepare students in any capacity to potentially live with a student of color, live with a student who has another religious identity, sexual orientation, that's when we have a lot of problems on campus, and students become socially withdraw. And our campuses are safe in terms of physical safety, but we talk about that emotional safety, and I think it can be scary for some of our rural students to be thrown into a really diverse setting where not only is it diverse in terms of the people that they're learning with, but the ideas that they're engaging with. And we're trying to really disrupt their worldview and kind of have them begin to question authority, question knowledge in different ways. And I think sometimes, I don't even think this is unique to rural students, but our students aren't prepared for that. And we can do a better job of preparing them in high school for that. I think they'll have more success.
So I guess the next evolution of our discussion about rural college access is what can we do to better support their attainment of that actual degree or credential once they get there on campus?
This is an area that I think we're just beginning to look at, and I read an article not so long ago about the whole idea of aspirational mismatch. So students are, we know the barriers. We've talked about kind of the situation in rural communities, but I'll unpack that just a little bit more, because one of the things we also know that we didn't talk about is Students that come from more rural high schools actually have less access to AB, IB courses, which we know are good preparation for the level of rigor. So it sometimes becomes a rigor, and I'm not overgeneralizing and saying that rural high schools do not prepare students for college. They just prepare them differently than sometimes the access that urban schools have. And a lot of times our rural high schools are under-resourced. So when we think about attainment, is we have these students that come, and sometimes it's a familial, you're going to be an engineer, Jacob, this is so exciting. And Jacob gets to school and finds out that, okay, I knew little about engineering. I also am not prepared to engage in engineering. I love school, but it's not what I want to do. That phone call home can be really, really challenging, and it can go something like, well, then, Jacob, you don't need to be there because that's what you were going to do. Instead of, there's 120 other things you could do, Jacob, and be just as successful. So sometimes that mismatch of education and understanding, it can be such a detriment to attainment and persistence. So we really need to, I don't have a great solution to work through that, but it's part of the problem here.
Well, and I know in our community we are doing more and more to help expose students to some of the career pathways earlier on in, as early as elementary school now. And so that starts to address some of that exploration, that questioning, the alignment of what I'm good at, what I like to do, with what majors, and then ultimately what careers. And I think that will make a difference for all of us as we invest more time and energy, so kids know what their why is before they even go away to college.
And even like job shadowing, and go to work with someone you think has a really cool job. I mean, those are ways that we also explore. I can speak for my daughter, and it wasn't until she still has kind of no idea what she wants to do, but she knows she wants to do something in English or writing. And it was a teacher that she wrote one paper and had this amazing feedback and developed the paper over and over again, and it stuck. And she started exploring, like, what are all the things you do with English? But I'm here to tell you, if she goes around and tells 10 people she's going to be an English major, the eye rolls, the what on earth would you do with that? So I think also as parents and community members, we have to be very mindful of how we react when students say, I want to be a history major versus an engineer, or some of our liberal arts, social science majors that may lead to differing kinds of careers. Not everybody's going to be a STEM major, and we also have lots of students who are not going to come out of their 4-year, their 2-year, their 4-year with the job that they went in thinking they would, and majors lead to all different kinds. So we, even as communities and parents, need to think about how we respond when students have that moment where the light bulb goes off and says, this is what I love to do.